Welcome, friends, to the Soul Talk podcast, a show where we explore and uncover the path to the heart, amplifying your conscience. Join me as we meet incredible souls who are in this journey and learn from their experience and different methods that will make you vibrate your heart. Let's get into it. Hello, everyone. This is Monica Ramirez, the Warrior of Love. And we are not only in Soul Talk, we are also in Soulology Network. And we have a person that I have met in person that is very, very special for me. I consider her my friend. And she have helped me tremendously in so many levels, in so many ways, in not only my speaking gigs, in the personal level. I really love this woman. Her name is Heidi Dunstan. I hope I say it right.
You said it the Spanish way, Heidi Dunstan. In the German way, it's Heidi Dunstan. But yeah,
Yes,
I love the way you say it. You know that I live in Mexico part of the time, so I'm used to the Spanish way.
Oh gosh, one day I might have to do the same thing, going to Mexico, and the same thing that you're doing. I should be doing myself. Let me tell you a little bit about Heidi. Heidi is she's a certified grief educator and best-selling author. Her passion is to helping others in the learning more about the grief and how to support others when they're grieving after losing her husband unexpectedly almost 3 years ago. She experienced all this, and that's how she became a grieving coach by her own experience. She's also one of the best-selling authors, and we're going to be talking a little bit about her book very soon. And Heidi, thank you for making the time, because I know you're always so busy all the time. And
Oh, Monica, I love spending time with you. You know that. And you're special to me as well. And I'm honored that you would allow me to be on your show. So thank you. It's a gift.
Beautiful. I would like to ask you, okay, there's different kinds of grieving, not only for losing a person, it can be losing a relationship. But I would like to first, let's talk about what is grieving.
So grief, the Grief Recovery Institute defines grief as a loss due to change of any kind, right? And so it isn't just going to be about death. It could be that somebody has passed away or an animal's passed away, but it could be that we've lost our job, that we've gone through a divorce. Maybe we've had a health change. Maybe we've in that job loss, we get a new job and financially we take a significant change, right? People grieve all through COVID when they saw that their money situation changed. People are grieving right now as the cost of things have increased tremendously. Well, kids grieve beautifully. Little kids, when they lose their pet rock or their balloon floats away or their ice cream hits the ground, that's grief. They're sad about those things. Teenagers grieve too. When you turn off the Wi-Fi or take a device away, their grief might look a little different than a toddler's, but it's still grief. And the hard part that people often don't realize is that grief is what I call an umbrella term. It's that umbrella that kind of covers off a ton of different emotions. And so there could be anger, there could be sadness, there could be depression or significant frustration, confusion. There could be gratitude, there could be regret, there could be guilt. There's a ton of emotions, all described by one little word of grief. And so people don't always understand when they say, oh, I'm grieving, but that grief doesn't look what they think it should look like, because grief can look very, very different for everybody.
And not only that, many people do not even realize that they are in any of these situations. I just had a client that she told me, I just realized that I am sad, that I have a deep depression for a long, long time, and until now. And it was like, wow, it's like how long a person can be grieving for long periods of time, and they don't even realize they are.
Yeah,
that would be me, that would be everybody.
Well, and the hard part is in our world, we also think that grief is just about death. And it isn't always, right? I recently was chatting with a friend who just went through breast cancer. And in her surgery, she lost part of her breast. And And, as she's getting back into the work world, she's realizing like my clothes don't fit the same. And I have to get undergarments that are different. And I said, my friend, you're grieving. You're grieving that you've lost a piece of your body. And the tears started. And I just said, you're allowed to. Like, this is significant. We as women identify so much of our femininity around our breasts. And so when all of a sudden we lose a piece of it, there is going to be grief there. But because we don't talk about grief very much, it takes a little bit to actually go, oh yeah, I am. Right. And a lot of people are worried that, oh, people are going to watch me, like, or judge me, right? There's lots of judgment in grief. And we don't live in a world that likes to deal with pain. And so we tend to leave all that stuff behind. But the reality is it creeps up into our everyday life. And we see it in different places and spaces. I mean, we're almost at the end of September. Think of all the parents that just sent their kids off to college and they've got empty nest syndrome. That's grief, right? Those are all normal. And yet a lot of people don't know how to identify it, because that one little word could mean something. And a mom could be sad and a dad could be mad, and they're both grieving. Because I believe griefs as individuals are fingerprint, and none of us do it the same, which means that none of us do it right or wrong. How we do it for ourselves is the only right way, and we don't get to decide how somebody else's grief looks for them.
And how do we overcome that? How we move forward? Because the pain is going to be there. The missing parts of whatever it is, from the breast, from a marriage, from a person that died, it is different, but it is the same pain. How we move forward with it?
You know what? I believe that grief is love. And that when we grieve somebody, it's because we love them. My first grief counselor after my husband died, that was about 6 or 7 months after he passed that I saw her. And I was very emotional in my first session. And I apologized for my tears and kind of felt bad that she had to see me in that state. And she said, Heidi, when I witness deep grief, it's because I'm witnessing deep love. It wouldn't hurt if you didn't love your person, if you didn't love that piece of you, if you didn't love the way your life was. And so lots of times when grief sneaks up on us, and my husband passed in 2018, so it's been almost 5 years that he's been gone, there are still days that I grieve. Are they as frequent as they were when he first passed? Definitely not. But can they be just as intense? There are days that can be. They're not as often, but there's days that I miss him. And so the way I kind of relate grief to people, like as an image, is when it first happens, it feels like you're carrying a huge boulder and it's insurmountable. Like it's awkward. You can't see around it. Your arms are sore. You're trying to hold this thing. And as you move through time, you start moving through those emotions and feeling them. And maybe you go and get help, or, get your health on track, whatever that looks like. And pieces of it'll start breaking away. And also your arms and your body start getting used to carrying it. So I'm not going to say that you get stronger, but you get used to carrying it. It's not as exhausting. And as it gets smaller and smaller, it becomes more and more manageable. And so that's where I think a lot of people use kind of the platitude that time heals all wounds. And I think that term is a little bit BS, I'll be honest with you, because I still can have days that are just as heavy and dark as the day that I lost my husband, Mike. But the reality is that I have gotten, my grief is now, I'm able to carry it. And on the days that I can't, I just give myself the grace to carry it the way I need to in that moment. But it's a matter of we carry those things, and some griefs are easy and they kind of just turn into bite size. You put it in your pocket and it maybe flares up, right? Like, so for example, it might be a grief like, I was diagnosed with cancer, and when you all of a sudden beat cancer, 5 years down the road, it could be like, wow, like I've come a long way. But you still look at that time and you still have all those memories. You still have all of that stuff. It just isn't as intense because you have moved through some of the emotions. right? And not everybody moves through the emotions. There are people that have anticipatory grief. They grieve before it actually happens. Some people have delayed grief. They don't move through the emotions right away. None of it's right or wrong.
But
The reality is we do things the way we need to do them. I would say the wrong thing that we do is that we judge others and we judge ourselves on how we do them. Because I can tell you, there are times that I didn't want to grieve, in the grocery store when I didn't have to buy milk again and the tears, like I'm messy crying in the grocery store. I didn't want to grieve then, but I didn't get a choice.
yeah,
And I had to allow myself to feel the feels. I tell people, feel the feels so that you can move through them, so that you can, and I never believe that you move on. I believe you do move forward. The language you used earlier, Monica, was bang on. We don't move on. It isn't just like, that's done.
yeah.
These are people and things in our lives that we love and cherish. And so know that that's possible. And know that sometimes you grieve things that you wish you had. There'll be people that are grieving, for example, say you have a parent who maybe wasn't the best parent. Maybe they were abusive, or maybe they did terrible things to you. You may grieve the fact that you never get a chance to have a healthy parent, or the parent that you wanted, or that, you saw on TV. And
Yeah.
that's a normal grief too. So sometimes we don't grieve the things that we've lost. We grieve the loss of a dream. Families that have kids with disabilities, they often go through grief, and it's the grief of, my kid will never be, quote, normal. And that is a normal grief to go through. Um, you
That is
know,
so true. Yes. When my dad, I had a delayed grief. It took me 5 years to actually cry it out and actually heal it. That was almost 20 years ago. And I promised myself, because this world is not conducive to actually understand that we have to honor our emotions. If you're angry, you have to hold it. If you're sad, you have to hold it. You have to hold all your emotions inside of you. So everything has to be peace and love. When in reality, when we're not honoring those, that is when I feel it linger more, the whatever emotion you're passing through.
well, the problem is that we live in this world that doesn't like pain. And
Mm.
so we're good. We're happy. Everybody's, oh, Monica's all peace and love. We're good. But when we're feisty and angry or sad or grieving, then that's when the big bad kryptonite comes out, and that's judgment. And that's when we judge people, and we forget that their grief will look different than our grief, and we compare. Right? I can tell you, the first 3 months after Mike passed, I heard every death story possible. I understand grief. I went through divorce. I totally understand grief. My 95-year-old grandma died. Oh, I understand grief. My goldfish died. I heard all of them. Right? And the reality is I wasn't in a state to carry those stories. My story felt way too heavy. But the reality is I know that the people didn't say it to me because they wanted me to carry it. They were trying to empathize with me. But
But
sometimes what ends up happening is we end up feeling like we're comparing.
yes, it is. I did a mistake a while back that I was like, oh well, I understand. I divorced, and when someone become a widow, and it's like, this is not the same. This was my choice,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
the other one wasn't my choice, and the other
Yeah.
one, when someone become widow, is not their choice.
Yeah.
It is very different having a choice than not having any choice at all.
And I'll agree with you. It is very different. And it is probably one of the things that I encourage people not to say, to
Mhm,
turn around and say, hey, I understand grief. I went through divorce, when somebody has just lost their spouse to death. They
mhm.
don't, there is grief in divorce, and it is significant, and it is just as intense, but it is not the same.
It is.
And it can really harm the person that you're saying it to, because they're not going to bump into their person at the mall anymore. They're not going to be able to hear their voice or their laugh anymore, or co-parent with them. Their whole world has shattered, right? And they're picking up the pieces. No different than you did in divorce, but you've got pieces where you'll pick up with that person, or still have the ability to to, oh, I ran into them at the restaurant, or, whatever that looks like post breakup. But so, yeah, I encourage people, don't say things like that. I encourage a lot of things to not say, because we say really weird things to people.
What do you say to someone that it is just recently lost someone?
Well, why don't we start with some of the things we don't say, because oftentimes those are what people relate to. And I tell grievers, and I learned this. I mean, I felt it. I felt it early on when Mike passed, and I felt it throughout my probably first 2 years of grief, where people just said things that missed the mark. And so things like, any sentence that starts with "at least." And we hear these kind of sentences. So at least they're not suffering anymore. For somebody who has just lost somebody to cancer, or maybe to ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, yeah, their person isn't suffering anymore. But the person who's standing right in front of you is suffering right now. They're missing their person. And so be cognizant that the "at least" really minimizes. At least you're young and you can find love again. My husband died the day before my 40th birthday. But it didn't mean that because he died that the switch turned off and that I was ready to find love again. At least you can get another dog. At least you can have another child. It doesn't acknowledge the fact that these griefs that we're having hurt right here, right now. So I encourage you to avoid any sentence that starts with "at least." I also don't love the phrase "I'm sorry for your loss." It's right up there with "thank you for your service." You talk to most service people and they're like, I don't know what to say to that. People just say it because they're supposed to, and that's what we're taught. But for me, I'm like, I'm sorry for your loss. It doesn't allow for connection. It doesn't acknowledge the fact that I'm in agony. So I encourage you to say, losing a parent is a significant loss. And I know how important your mom was for you. And my heart goes out to you. That's a way different story. It might be, or may I share a story of your husband, Keith? I remember when, and be able to bring a memory alive if the person wants to hear that story. And then I also encourage, a lot of people will say, call me if you need me. I heard it hundreds of times. I didn't know what I needed. So I didn't make any phone calls. But the people that showed up, my neighbor who said, hey, because I lived in a condo complex, leave your garbage on the doorstep and we'll make sure that it gets taken out so you don't have to people worry about it. Or the people who just said, hey, I'm going to the grocery store. What do you need? My friend who had children and she became a widow. Hey, I'm driving my kids to school. Can I pick your kids up too along the way? Would that help today? Offer specific help because they don't know they need it. I lost 30 pounds in the first 3 months after losing my husband, and everybody raved. I mean, me, Monica, I have a little bit of extra. It wasn't a bad thing for me to lose it, but everybody raved at how good I looked. I had one friend who reached out and said, have you lost all this weight because you're not eating? Yes. And I said, yeah, I hate eating alone. My brain fog is so bad that I burning stuff on the stove if I have more than one pot cooking. Like I said, and I feel sick to my stomach when I eat, so I just eat once a day. And she's like, I'd like to have you over for dinner. And why don't you stay the night and we'll watch movies and we'll have popcorn and maybe ice cream if you feel up to it. And I'd like to bring some Tupperware and I'll send you home with leftovers so you just have some stuff to reheat. Right? That's grace. Those are when you lean in. And I call my program Lean Into Grief. It's those moments when when you feel like you don't have the right words to say, those are the moments when you're meant to lean in and support somebody and hold space for them and see them and love them exactly where they're at. We talked earlier a little bit about judgment, and all people want when they're grieving is to be seen, right? They want you to see them. They don't want you to say, hey, don't cry, you'll make me cry too. Because what happens is that wall goes up, the armor goes up, and they stop talking to you. And so instead I turn around and I say, thank you. Thank you for sharing your tears with me. As you can see, because I'm a sprinkler, I'll cry with them and I thank them. And I'm grateful that they share their heart with me. That's a gift. It's an honor. It's not a burden to me. And when you see that when somebody shares those tears, they're sharing love with you. It's a hard love because they're learning to love their person when they're not here anymore. They're having to learn to love that person that they've lost, that isn't here anymore. And so when all of a sudden they're like, hey, I just need a place that somebody sees me, it can be such a gift. It can really, truly be something that you have no idea in the moment, and they may not acknowledge it in the moment because in that moment there's a lot going on. But I can tell you, I remember the man who sat with me 11 months after my husband died in a restaurant and just let me messy cry in my soup. And he wasn't throwing Kleenex in my face. He wasn't telling me to, get over it. He wasn't telling me to stop crying, that we were in a public place. He just let me cry. I will remember that man for the rest of my life because he held space. He didn't try to fix it. You can't fix it. The only thing that fixes it is bringing Mike back. You can't fix dead, but you can witness grief. You can hold space and just love somebody exactly where they're at without judgment.
That is so true. You make me remember all the things that I heard when my mother died about 2 years ago, and all the things that I heard then, that I was like, just okay, like basically I came to understand in the funeral, do not cry, hold it in, and just pass this through these days, as horrible as they are, and you're gonna survive. You already survived the father, you can survive this one. But it was holding it in and holding it in and holding it in, and many things that I wanted to talk, that later on, even when going to people to eat, there's like, oh, you don't want to talk about your mom, please don't. And
Yeah.
it's like, and why am I here eating with you?
Yeah, it's about holding space and knowing that there's going to be times that you don't have the words.
Yeah.
And lots of times what happens is when we don't have the words, we get silent and we don't say anything. And for those people that are grieving, that silence is deafening. It's like, don't you see me? Don't you see this hurts? Don't you see that I'm shattered inside? And so I encourage you, if you don't know what to say that. Say, I don't know what to say here. Like, this sucks. I remember, and I don't know if I can cuss on here, but I saw a friend about 6 months after Mike died, and somebody had said to her, yeah, Heidi just lost her spouse. And she goes, well, that's just shit. And I was like, it is just shit. Thank you. It wasn't I'm sorry for your loss and that awkward weirdness. She was like, that sucks. Like, I can't fix it. There's nothing I can do or say, but I'm going to say what it is, which was way better than, the person who tried talking to me about NFL Super Bowl stats. And I was like, that, like, my husband just died 4 weeks ago. She's like, yeah, I just don't know what to talk about when that happens. So I just make weird conversation. And I was like, and it's weird. Like, because I don't watch football.
No.
Right. And so just love people where they're at. Do it without judgment. Know that how they grieve may look very differently than how you grieve, and that's okay. It's those statements that people make, like, it's been 5 months, you're not over that yet. There is no timeline on grief. Oh, they took their wedding band off. Oh, they're trying for another baby. Oh, look, they got another dog. We don't get to decide what that looks like and what's right for people and what's not. I just love people exactly where they're at, and even when it's ugly. And sometimes grief comes with anger, and sometimes they don't say the nicest things, and I still show up and I still say, hey, I see this is hard. It's about giving people a little bit of grace. And I tell grievers, you got to give the people around you a bit of grace too, because they're not so good at this. And nobody said these things to me out of malice. Nobody was like, oh, Heidi lost her husband, let's kick her while she's down and say all these terrible things. They say them because they've never been taught.
That is
Our
so.
our grief culture goes to about the service or maybe a week after, and then we don't know what to do after that.
Yes, I even did put a timeline, how long you have to grieve.
It says, how long do you get to breathe? I will love and grieve my husband to the last breath I take. Plain and simple.
That is so true. But how do you, what is the normal, I don't even know how to say these words. How long do you know that actually you need help? Let's
I
say,
always say that if it feels insurmountable, get help. I knew I needed help. I knew that the loss was unexpected. He had a heart attack. I wasn't anticipating this, and I knew that I needed help. My whole life turned inside out and upside down in an hour. And I didn't have anything to relate to. And so I went and I encourage people, get specific grief help. Go and see somebody certified in grief. Don't just go and see a counselor or a psychologist. I saw a general counselor about 3 months after my husband died. And she was like, you're doing everything right. I was like, are you kidding me? Like, I'm not functioning. She's like, yeah, you're doing it all right. Like, I'm like, I didn't need cheerleading. I need somebody to show me that what's ahead. Like, how am I going to navigate this and remind me that this is normal and spell out some of this stuff that doesn't make sense. And when I saw a grief counselor who actually was able to see and witness me and then said, hey, like, why don't you go into a young widows group therapy as well, so that I could go and learn from other widows that were in the same, like I wasn't with I was 39 years, I was just 40 years old. So I went in a group with a bunch of young widows, not widows that were 70 years old that had been married 30 years. And so, I got to learn that I wasn't the only one going through this, and that even though other people's circumstances were different, like some of them had kids and some of them had different types of losses, that the process had similarities, but that how we all navigate it was basically how we needed to. It was kind of like the choose your own adventure. Right? You just didn't get to choose. It was, you had to navigate it your way. And you have to do it with the grace. And so do it with a professional. You can even read like Megan Devine's book, It's Okay That You're Not Okay. She was a psychotherapist and she stopped practicing after her husband died. And she realized that she was not equipped to help people with grief because she was never really trained well enough to handle it. I've seen, I was messaging with a widow probably a couple of years ago, and her husband, she was 37. Her husband died in a workplace accident, and it wasn't even 9 months after. And she was at her doctor's office trying to get some medication to help her cope because she wasn't sleeping. And the doctor was like, out of all my patients, you take the biggest prize in grieving the hardest. That came from a doctor. So It's not a surprise to me that us everyday people that haven't been trained in bedside manner or death and dying screw it up. And so I always tell grievers, like, give the people around you some grace when they say stuff and they stick their foot in their mouth. Instead of ripping their head off, let them know that, hey, that kind of missed the mark. Tell them about Heidi's free complimentary classes, because they don't say it because they want to hurt you. It's uncomfortable. They have a hard time seeing the fact that their friend or their loved one is hurting and they can't fix it.
And some of them, they had to. I remember when I recently divorced, when my son was 5 years old. I was 21 years old, about. I was way younger, and I was grieving. I was in that pain and so forth. And I went to a therapist. And the first thing, he was the dean of the university where I live, of psychology. And he told me, well, And like, why you're so sad? It's like, well, I just recently divorced. I have now 3 kids, and I did not know how to move forward or what I was going to do with my life and educating 3 little boys and so forth. When he tell me, well, don't even look for anyone else. You just have to wait 10, at least, no, he was 8, 10 years more until your son is 18 years old so you can remake your life. That day I went in a depression so deep because it's like, I have to wait 10 years really to start living again, or it's like, what, that's the next step in 10 years. What is next? And that was a dean on the university saying those kind of things when they're
Yeah.
supposed to be trained.
Yeah.
Not all of them. Grieve. I feel that your expertise, it is very unique. That is
Thank you.
not for all the therapists or coaches. They can
Yeah.
deal with the same thing because of the judgment.
Yeah.
It is depending on whatever they have lived. If they have never been in grieving in any aspect or divorce or passing through anything, for them to have that empathy.
Yeah.
Sometimes they cannot get it. They don't
And
understand.
and people don't understand because they haven't had the experience. They haven't lived it. You know, I guarantee that I said crappy things to people before I lost my husband. I know I did. I know I said, I'm sorry for your loss. I know I kind of was like, hey, like, it's been a year. You're still, this is still on your mind. Like, and not that I was that callous, but it feels that callous to somebody who's in agony because they've lost somebody. And I handle those things very different, now. I know, like, I mean, you know me, I travel quite a bit. Like you know some of my Uber adventures. I spend a lot of time in airplanes and in Ubers. And you're laughing because I have some good Uber stories, don't I? But oftentimes, I end up chatting with the drivers and they always ask, like, are you married? And I say, no, I'm widowed. If I'm feeling like I want to go down that path. And the first question people ask me, and these are complete strangers, I'm in another country in a car, how did your husband die? How did your husband, why does that matter? How does that information help me? Like, you're now making me go back to the day that he had his heart attack. You're now making me go back to the day that I have to remember that I did CPR on him, that I cracked his ribs open, like that that was the hardest day of my life. And so I don't ask cause of death. And I'll be honest with you, I believe that it's the TV and movies, that crime shows that, we always ask, oh, how did they die? Well, the reality is when you don't know the person, and even if you do know the person, you probably don't actually need to know, because unless you know how to bring them back from the dead, you can't fix that. And so I don't ask. I don't need to know. And if I felt like I needed to know, like, for example, about 9 months after Mike died, I was at my husband was a fireman, and I was at a dinner with a bunch of firemen. And one of the men that I ended up sitting beside saw my husband the week before he died. And so I could see that he was devastated. He's like, I saw him and he was so happy and he was talking about you and how in love he was. And then a week later, I got an email that he had died. And instead of saying, what was the cause of death? He said, may I ask what happened? He asked for permission if I was willing to go there. Could I handle that? Because here's a man who has dealt with people on their worst days of their lives. He's seen people have to find loved ones who've committed suicide or died by overdose or died in car accidents. And he knows that those days are traumatic. And I learned so much from him that day because he gave me a bit of grace. I'm at a dinner full of people that were going to honor my husband that night. And may I ask what happened? Instead of, how did he die?
Yeah, that is too intrusive.
Because I felt it was fair to share with him. Now I share my husband's cause of death because I know that everybody's curious. How did the young lady's husband die? Because a lot of people want to know if it's weird, like suicide, COVID, addiction, things like that. But the reality is when we do ask people, you're now asking them to relive probably one of the hardest days in their life. And you don't need that information. And so I encourage you not to ask it. If you feel like you've got to get a sense of where things are at, I sometimes will ask, was it expected? And it's not to minimize expected and unexpected deaths, but sometimes it'll tell me when the person's been sick. No, the person's been sick for 6 months. We kind of knew it was coming. Or no, it wasn't. We had no idea this was coming. And it could be something like, I have friends that have lost spouses due to being hit by a car while they're in a crosswalk. Like some of the real tragic ones, like addiction or suicide. I don't need to make them relive those days. I really don't. I will hold space and I will listen to them if they want to share with me, but I'm not going to force them to go there.
Yes, I have one of my sisters. Her son died about 7 years ago or 8 years ago. She had never recuperated from that, and that's why my question was: to what point do you actually advise that, hey, you need some help? Because
everybody's different. I mean, the reality is if you going to help means that at 7 years later and you're sitting there like a lump on a log, it's not going to help you. You have to be willing to do the work, and some people just aren't. I met a woman. I was going to my first counseling session, and I come out of the session, I looked like I'd been in my first counseling session. I'd been messy crying, and I ran into her in the hallway. I didn't know her. And she's like, did you just come out of the grief program? And I'm like, yeah. She goes, may I ask who passed away? I said, my husband. And she goes, when? And I said, 6 months ago. She said, do the work now. She goes, my husband died 7 years ago. And I went up and traveled for 7 years. And now I got to do the work, and it's harder now. And she goes, I wasn't able to do it until now. But if you can, don't avoid it. But some people, that's their way. Some people, they can't move through it. Some people need time. Some people process it very differently. I was chatting with a woman recently who, her brother, he's like, I don't want to talk about it. His daughter was murdered. And he's like, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to know about anything. You just don't talk about it. And that's his way right now. And it isn't anybody else's job for him to move through that than his own. And he will do it when he's ready. Or maybe he is doing it and it just looks very different than what other people are going through. And that's okay. We don't get to decide. And the hard part is lots of times when we're grieving and we see that somebody else is grieving in a way that we don't recognize, we then want to try to fix it, because it's way easier to fix somebody else than move through our own emotions. And sometimes I have to say to people, like, why do you need to talk to them about this? Why? What is the purpose? Is it that you're trying to avoid your own emotions? And I would say probably 75% of the time it is about them. It's easier to help somebody than to go through and feel the pain that we're feeling. But the hard part is when we do that, it often makes the other person feel like they're being judged because they're not doing it the right way.
That is so true. That is so true. And I learned, if I took something from today, it is that, because we're so conditioned that we have to all be like uniform emotions, and this is how we should be. This is how in the movie looks like. But that's just conditioning that we are accepting that it doesn't have to be true.
I recorded a podcast recently where the podcaster said, I watched a movie recently and a lady was grieving and she wasn't crying, so I thought she was a crappy actress. And she goes, and now after talking to you, I'm realizing she's just representing grief in a really different way. And that character maybe resonates for the people that don't cry. Because there's lots of people that, I cry enough for many people, I think. I'm a sprinkler, but there's lots of people that don't cry, and that's okay. They find other ways to move through their emotions. And just because the tears don't come through, it doesn't mean they're not grieving. But there isn't a normal look of grief.
That is so true. And I would like to ask you, okay, I know you wrote a book. What is the name of the book? Hi.
So I contributed a chapter to the Blue Talks Volume 3, and I'm currently writing 2 books, but you know my schedule and it's a little full. So one is a legacy book about my husband. I believe that when we actually get to hold space and love people in grief with people, that we also get to carry on the legacies of people that we've lost. And I believe it's our duty to leave the legacies. And so what I've done is I've gotten 10 chapters from 10 of my husband's friends, and I'm compiling them to talk about the legacy that he's left behind and how losing him looks really different for all 10 of us. And so it's a bit of a passion project. I really I don't know if you know this, but I'm actually, without my contacts, I'm legally blind. And when I was young, they actually didn't think that I'd be able to. They thought I'd have a developmental disability. And so I always had a dream once I got glasses that I would write a book. And so it's a real important book for me to get out there first, is this passion project of Mike's legacy, because even though he's gone, he's still helping my dreams come true, which I think is pretty magical. But then the other book will be about what to say and not say to somebody who's grieving. And again, a lot of the same things that we've talked about today, but I may actually also include some chapters from people who have lost, maybe had a stillborn birth or a miscarriage, people that have lost people due to addiction or suicide or murder. So that, because the words matter in grief, and I truly believe the reason why people don't say anything at all is because they're afraid they're going to screw it up, and they know that the words matter, and they're afraid they're going to stick their foot in their mouth. And so I encourage people, when you see grief, whether it be a child that has lost their balloon, or a teenager that has lost their internet, or a friend that maybe broke their ankle and can't drive, um, or somebody who is grieving a divorce, or whatever that looks like, you work your grief muscles in those uncomfortable situations, learn some of these tools, and just start being comfortable with some of the uncomfortable conversations that we're not used to, so that when we have to be with people that we care about that are enduring pain, that we feel like we're equipped to handle those conversations rather than to go silent. You know, grief is love. And when we can do it together, it allows for connection. And so I encourage people, I want people to grieve with grace together.
And more because in that moment, that's when they feel more alone. So that isolation,
Isolation. Yeah. You got it. Yeah.
It is so tremendously, because you feel that no one will understand you. So people tend to become hermits in that time.
Mm-hmm.
So those were great advices to do when someone just lost someone.
Yeah. Well, and know that, you know, when all of a sudden you go silent, or you go and you're disappearing, it means that they're having to grieve you too. You know, I lost 4 of my closest friends after Mike died, and I grieved the loss of them for the first few months harder, because I was like, they're still here. Why can't they see me? Why am I invisible all of a sudden? Now it's taken me some time to realize that, you know, I was a reminder to them, because there was 6 of us that all hung out, and without Mike here, I was a reminder to them that Mike was gone. But in that moment, that first year, it ripped my heart out that I had to lose them too. And so know that when you don't show up, you're making them grieve another loss. And so show up. And even if you don't know what to say that. I don't have words. I'm not good at this, but you're important to me, and I want to show up for you. And when I screw it up, and say when I screwed up, but know that you probably will, because I mean, I'm trained in this, and there's times I screw it up. Right. And so please tell me, like, give them permission to be real with you. Know that you're not intentionally doing this, that you're doing the best you can. You know, grace means that you give yourself grace, you're giving the other person grace, and they're giving you grace, right? Nobody wants to have these conversations, but the reality is all of us are going to grieve. All of us will lose people, all of us will lose things. And so be graceful, be gentle, Be gentle with yourself, and just show up the best way that you can without judgment. You don't judge how people live happy. I mean, we talked about peace and love earlier. I don't look at Monica and go, oh, is that how she does happiness? I'd be like, look at her, look how happy she is. I always tell people about like the America's Got Talent when they get the golden buzzer. When they get the golden buzzer, none of them celebrate the same way. Their dream just came true. They're not celebrating the same way, but we don't judge them, but we do judge how people live through pain. And we get to choose. You get to choose to say, hey, you know what? I need to stop that. How they go through pain is how they go through pain. And it isn't for me to tell them what that's supposed to look like or how long it's supposed to be. Love them exactly where they're at. That's what they deserve. That's what they need.
Or if they're angry, to just let them be there.
They're not angry at you. They're angry that their life has changed.
Yes.
Right? They're angry that they could. I mean, I was angry at Mike. You left me with a huge mess to clean up. You left me by myself. You taught me that I could be loved, and then all of a sudden you died, and now I got to do it again. No, I was angry. Right? Rightfully so. It's part of the process. It sucks sometimes. It's hard. There's also beautiful parts of grief. I'm really open about my grief. I'm grateful I had Mike. As much as losing him broke me inside, I'm grateful I had him. My life would be very, very, a lot less if I didn't have him in my life. And so those moments when I'm going through the dark parts of grief, when I need to move forward and need to get out of that and get back to living, it's that I'm grateful. I'm grateful that I had him.
And something that everybody has to remember, that when someone is showing up just angry all the time, probably they're depressed. They're saying it's an angry person. Yes, but what is behind that anger?
I always say anger is one letter short of danger. It's an emotion, but if you don't actually stop and look, it's a surface emotion. And it's kind of like the scratch ticket that you get at the gas station. If you scratch off, you'll see a different emotion behind it.
Yes.
Right. Or a different reason. Like you think that they're angry about this, but really it could be that they're sad about something else, or they're missing something, or that they're, feeling guilty or regret. There'll be another emotion behind it. So
it is. Even it doesn't matter what emotion it is, there's always something behind. That's why the healing process for the human being, it never ends.
It never ends. Yeah.
Well,
and
behind.
And know that it shifts. Like, I had a friend who her husband died 12 years ago. And she's a grief lady. Like, she's trained in all this stuff. One of her big grief days happened to be her birthday. But it was the birthday that she now was older than her husband, because he was 12 years older than her. And all of a sudden it hit her like a ton of bricks. And other people are like, well, why is it bugging you? Because it was never supposed to be that way. And so, know that it may not look the same. Know that it could be 12 years. It could be 15. My husband was 24 years older than me. So when I turn 63, it's going to be probably have some emotion to it. It might be emotionally charged, and that's okay. I'm allowed to. I give myself that permission. You know me. You know that I can schedule everything. You know that I run events. You know that I'm really good at order.
Yes.
Grief fucks that shit up.
And it is okay to actually be vulnerable and say, you know what, today I'm not feeling right for every single day you're passing through.
Yep.
Sometimes we have to stop and say, it doesn't matter you're a grieving coach or you're a coach or a healer, whatever you are. We all passing through emotions.
Yeah.
And we need to honor them, because if we do not honor them, we're trying to push it down and hide them from ourselves. It's just going to come up until we actually do that inner work.
And know that sometimes that stuff comes percolating. Like there's times where I'll walk past somebody and they're wearing a cologne,
Mm.
the same one that Mike wore. And I'm like, and I'm like, oh, and some days it'll bring tears to my eyes and other days it'll bring a smile to my face. And that's the reality of it, right? Like, we don't get to choose. Those memories will percolate in different places and spaces. And so it can come up when we least expect it. And we think about grief and we think that it's just a personal loss. So you just deal with it at home. But it happens at the office.
Mhm.
You think about your loved ones at the office. You think about the dog that you just lost at the office. So grief shows up at the office. We need to use these skills at the office just as much as we do at home. The grace is needed. I mean, I remember my husband's funeral was about 2 weeks after he died because of the holiday season, because he died at Christmas time. And then it was on a Friday. And on a Monday, I had my business, right? On the Sunday after his service, I got an email from one of my clients who was at his service. So she knew he died. Said, the list of things for Heidi to do is growing. Are you going to be available to do it on Monday or should I find somebody else?
Mm.
My response was, find somebody else. Because my other clients messaged me and said, hey, Heidi, we know that have gone through hell and back. How do we support you? What does it look like? What do you need?
Mhm.
And they gave me that grace for a year. Like, where I phoned them and said, I know we talked about this in January, that I can't do work on the fly. Like, I need longer time to get work done. And you guys have done that, but I now need to probably make a little bit of money. The bills need to get paid. And they were like, we were waiting on you.
Yes, I remember one of my best friends died about 7 years too. And we used to paint murals together. And we painted in different restaurants here locally. And I avoid going to those restaurants because I did not want the memories. Until finally, this last year, I took my daughter and it's like, let me show you some murals that I did with Juan Carlos. And we went and it's like, oh yeah, I remember Juan Carlos was over there. He almost fell down from that chair painting that mural. And I was over here. The paint was going to fall on top of me. But now we can talk and laugh about it.
Mm-hmm.
But I avoid those places for 7 years.
Yeah.
Because it was too painful to go and have those memories back. And sometimes it is, take your time, but it is important that you will see them later on, the same stories in a very different way.
Yeah.
Like now I could laugh with my daughter about the paint that was going to fall on top of me and things like that. And now we can laugh about it. But that is
and everybody does that differently. Like, some people might be like, hey, I need to see those murals. Hey, I want those memories. And other people, yeah, it's too painful. And neither one of them are wrong.
yeah.
And that's okay. Right?
Yes.
Be gentle with the people around you. Be gentle with yourself. Know that this is something we don't talk about. Like, literally all we've been taught to do is send some flowers, maybe a card, attend a service. Some of us might make a lasagna. And then when the service is done, we really don't know what to do or say.
Yes.
And so know that judgment is grief's kryptonite. Like, every time I see the word judgment now, I just see that big green stone in Superman. And just love somebody exactly where they're at. And even if you don't agree with it, even if it shouldn't look that way in your eyes, just be like, this is their process. And all they need to do is be seen.
I know you have some classes once in a while that you teach when you have time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
when or how the people can get a
So
hold of
visit on my website, HeidiDunstan.ca, under events. I just did one last night.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Heidi. Do you have
Thank you, Monica.
you would like to say before we?
No, thank you. It's been a real treat being able to chat with you. I've missed chatting with you. It's been a couple months. So thank you for taking the time to be with me.
Thank you, everybody. This is Monica Ramirez, the Warrior of Love, and thank you for being in Soul Talk on Zoology Network.